bound by true courage. Isabel Bell Carter had spent her life making safe choices, never betting more than she could afford to lose. But when Cass Rhodes slid a deck of cards toward her, his smirk slow and knowing, she knew she was in trouble. He leaned in, fingers brushing against hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Walk away or take a gamble on me." Chapter 1. A Debt of the Heart. The air in the Golden Nugget Saloon hung thick with the scent of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present dust that seemed to seep into everything in Redemption, Arizona. Isabel Bell Carter gripped the edge of the worn, mahogany table, her knuckles white against the polished wood. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, curious, pitying, some even predatory. It was a sensation she'd grown accustomed to in the past few months, ever since her husband, Thomas, had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a mountain of debts and a whispered rumor of betrayal. She'd traded her fine dresses for simple calico, her comfortable life in St. Louis for a cramped room above the very saloon where she now found herself, cornered. Her once delicate hands were now calloused from scrubbing floors and washing glasses, a far cry from the piano keys they used to dance across. Each day was a struggle, a constant reminder of how far she'd fallen. But she'd held on to her pride, her dignity. Until now. Across from her, Cass Rhodes sat with the easy confidence of a man who held all the cards, both literally and figuratively. He was a gambler, notorious throughout the territory, with a reputation as sharp and dangerous as the knife he kept strapped to his thigh. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky just before the lightning strikes, held a glint of amusement that sent a shiver of unease down Bell's spine. He wasn't a handsome man, not in the conventional sense. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of hard living and countless nights under the unforgiving desert stars. A jagged scar bisected his left eyebrow, a silent testament to a past he clearly didn't shy away from. Yet, there was a magnetism to him, a raw, untamed energy that both terrified and intrigued her. He'd arrived in Redemption just a week ago, a whirlwind of whispered rumors and wary glances. He'd quickly made his presence known, winning big at the poker tables, his laughter echoing through the saloon, a sound that was both captivating and menacing. Belle had tried to avoid him, to stay in the shadows, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. Thomas's debts, the ones she'd been desperately trying to chip away at, had somehow ended up in Rhodes's possession. "Evening, Mrs. Carter," he'd said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. He'd approached her earlier that evening, sliding into the seat opposite her with the effortless grace of a predator cornering its prey. He hadn't threatened her, not explicitly. But the underlying menace was there, a subtle pressure that made her heart pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Now, he pushed a deck of cards across the table, the cards fanning out with a practiced flick of his wrist. The gesture was almost elegant, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn surroundings. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured, his voice a silken whisper that somehow managed to carry over the din of the saloon. His fingers, long and tanned, brushed against hers as he spoke, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in years, a spark of something dangerous. "Walk away, and well, let's just say the vultures in this town ain't picky." Or he paused, his stormy eyes locking onto hers, holding her captive in their intense gaze. "Take a gamble on me." Belle swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it difficult to speak. "Walk away? And do what?" She had nothing left, no one to turn to. The vultures he spoke of were the men who'd been circling her since Thomas's disappearance, their offers of help thinly veiled propositions that made her skin crawl. She'd fought them off, clinging to the last vestiges of her self-respect. But Rhodes, he was different. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a chance. A dangerous, reckless chance, but a chance nonetheless. She looked at the cards, then back at him. Her mind raced, weighing the options, the risks. Her life in St. Louis felt like a distant dream, a faded photograph of a woman she no longer recognized. She'd been raised to be a lady, to be polite, to be safe. But safety had brought her nothing but ruin. Perhaps it was time to embrace something else. Something wilder. What kind of gamble? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, betraying the tremor of fear that ran through her. Rhodes smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a smile that promised both danger and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. A simple game, Mrs. Carter. One hand. Winner takes all. And if I win? Belle asked, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, calculating. You win. Your debts are cleared. You walk away a free woman. And if I lose? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. His smile widened, a hint of something predatory flickering in his eyes.
If you lose, you belong to me.
The words hung in the air, stark and shocking. Belong to him. The thought sent a wave of fear washing over her, but beneath the fear, a flicker of something else ignited. A spark of defiance, of excitement? It was madness. Utter madness. But as she looked into his eyes, into the depths of that stormy gray, she saw something that mirrored her own desperation, her own yearning for something more. She saw a reflection of the wildness that had been simmering beneath her carefully constructed facade for years, a wildness that was now threatening to break free. She thought of Thomas, of his charming smile and empty promises, of the life she'd thought she wanted, the life that had crumbled to dust around her. She thought of the endless days of drudgery, of the loneliness that gnawed at her soul. And then she looked at Cass Rhodes, at the dangerous gamble he offered, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she had nothing left to lose. She took a deep breath, the scent of whiskey and dust filling her lungs. Deal the cards, Mr. Rhodes, she said, her voice steadier now, infused with a newfound resolve. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the saloon. Every eye was on them, watching, waiting. The air crackled with anticipation. He dealt the cards, his movements swift and precise. 5 cards face down. 5 cards that held her fate. 5 cards that would determine whether she would walk away a free woman or belong to him. She picked up her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She glanced at the cards, her heart sinking. A jumble of mismatched numbers and suits. Nothing. A losing hand. But then, she looked closer. At the corner of one card, a tiny, almost imperceptible mark. A mark she recognized. A mark Thomas used to use when he was cheating. A wave of anger, hot and fierce, surged through her. Thomas. Even from beyond the grave, he was still manipulating her, still controlling her fate. And then she understood. Rhodes hadn't just acquired her debts. He'd orchestrated this whole thing. He'd known all along. He'd played her. He was waiting for her reaction, and it felt, even miles away, that she was a fool, that even now, she was letting her guard down. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The realization hit Belle like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. It wasn't just anger she felt, but a deep, searing betrayal. Not just by Thomas, whose ghost seemed to haunt every corner of her life, but by Rhodes, who had presented himself as something else. A chance, however dangerous. A way out. She'd been naive, foolishly allowing a flicker of hope to blind her to the obvious. She carefully placed her cards back on the table, face down, her movements deliberate, masking the turmoil that raged within her. She met Rhodes's gaze, her own eyes narrowed, the blue in them hardening to the cold, sharp glint of steel. The amusement in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a wary curiosity. He was waiting for her to break, to crumble, to plead. But Belle Carter, the woman who had been shaped by the gentle breezes of St. Louis, was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the crucible of the Arizona desert, a woman who had learned to survive. "You knew," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued her earlier. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Rhodes didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. I knew your husband was a cheat, Mrs. Carter. And I knew he taught you his tricks. And you used that against me, she said, the bitterness lacing her words. He shrugged, a nonchalant movement that belied the tension that had coiled in the air between them. A man uses what he has. Just like you, Mrs. Carter. The implication stung. He was right, of course. She had considered using Thomas's tricks, the subtle markings he'd taught her years ago, a secret language shared between husband and wife, a language meant for whispered jokes and playful deception, not for this. She'd rejected the idea almost as soon as it had formed, clinging to the last vestiges of her honor. But the temptation had been there, a dark whisper in the back of her mind.
Why?
She asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. Why go to all this trouble? Why not just take what you wanted? He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his gaze intense, unwavering. The lamplight flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the rugged lines etched by time and hardship. Because, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine, I wanted to see what you were made of. I wanted to see if you were a woman who would fold under pressure or a woman who would fight.
And what did you see?
She challenged, her chin lifting slightly. A slow smile spread across his lips, a smile that held a hint of admiration. It was a fleeting expression, quickly masked, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. I saw a woman who's been dealt a bad hand, Mrs. Carter. But I also saw a woman who's not afraid to play the game. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He wasn't just talking about the cards, about the debt. He was talking about something more, something deeper. He was talking about life, about survival, about the choices they both had made, the paths they both had walked. Belle felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. Anger, yes, but also a grudging respect. He was a gambler, a cheat, a man who lived by his own rules. But he was also honest in his own way. He hadn't pretended to be anything other than what he was. He'd laid his cards on the table, so to speak, and given her a choice. A terrible choice, but a choice nonetheless. She thought of the shadows that clung to him, the whispers she'd heard about his past. Rumors of a life lost, of a love betrayed, of a debt of his own that he was still trying to repay. She dismissed them as saloon gossip, but now, looking into his eyes, she saw a flicker of pain, a hint of vulnerability that he tried to conceal. She saw a man who was haunted by his own demons, just as she was.
What happens now?
She asked, her voice softer now, the edge of anger dulled by a growing sense of understanding. Rhodes pushed himself back from the table, the scrape of his chair against the wooden floor echoing in the sudden silence of the saloon. He stood there for a moment, towering over her, his presence both intimidating and strangely comforting. Now, he said, his voice a low murmur, we find out what you're willing to gamble on, Mrs. Carter. He extended his hand towards her, his palm open in invitation. It wasn't a demand, not a threat. It was a challenge, a test, a chance. She looked at his hand, at the callous fingers, the strong, steady grip. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the life she'd lost. She thought of the future that stretched before her, uncertain, unknown. And then, she did something that surprised even herself. She reached out and took his hand. His grip tightened around hers, a firm, reassuring pressure that sent a jolt of warmth through her. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet.
It was a pact.
A deal sealed between two gamblers, two souls adrift in the unforgiving landscape of the West. He didn't say anything, just nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. He turned and walked towards the door of the saloon, his steps purposeful, his back straight. Belle followed him, her head held high, her heart pounding a steady rhythm against her ribs. The eyes of the saloon followed them, curious, speculative. But Belle didn't care. She was no longer the grieving widow, the helpless victim. She was something else now. Something more. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the vast expanse of the star-studded sky stretching above them, Belle felt a sense of freedom. It was a terrifying freedom, a freedom born of desperation and defiance, but it was freedom nonetheless. She didn't know what the future held, what dangers lay ahead. But she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone. She had made a gamble, a reckless, desperate gamble. And she was ready to play the game. The dust swirled around them as they headed out, and Belle wondered what this partnership would unveil. Chapter 3. The Devil's Bargain. The cool night air offered a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the Golden Nugget. Belle walked beside Rhodes, her senses on high alert. The town of Redemption, usually bustling even at this late hour, seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant strains of a melancholic guitar from a hidden cantina. The wooden sidewalks creaked beneath their boots, a rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of her heart. She glanced at Rhodes, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. He walked with a quiet confidence, his shoulders squared, his head held high. He didn't speak, didn't offer any explanation, any reassurance. He simply moved, a force of nature navigating the familiar streets. She wondered where he was taking her. To his room above the saloon? To some hidden hideout on the outskirts of town? The possibilities, both terrifying and strangely exhilarating, swirled in her mind. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the stillness of the night. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. They were heading away from the main thoroughfare, towards the edge of town, where the buildings thinned out, giving way to the vast, open expanse of the desert. The moon, a silver crescent in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. "To collect what's mine," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind. The words sent a shiver down her spine. What's mine? He was referring to her, of course. To the debt. To the bargain they had struck. But there was something else in his tone, a possessiveness that both frightened and intrigued her. They reached a small, dilapidated shack on the very edge of town. It was a humble dwelling, a far cry from the opulent homes she'd once known. The wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the roof sagged precariously, and the single window was boarded up, casting the interior into darkness. A rusty horseshoe hung above the door, a faded symbol of luck, or perhaps a warning. Rhodes stopped in front of the shack, his hand resting on the weathered door handle. He turned to face her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, searching hers. The moonlight illuminated his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the rugged lines etched by time and hardship. He looked dangerous. And yet, there was a vulnerability there, a flicker of something that resonated with her own hidden wounds. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded.
"For now."
"It's not what I expected," she admitted, her gaze sweeping over the ramshackle structure. A faint smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that softened the harsh lines of his face. "Disappointed, Mrs. Carter?" "Surprised," she corrected, her chin lifting slightly. "I expected something more ostentatious." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. "Ostentation is for fools, Mrs. Carter. I prefer practicality." He pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside, beckoning her to follow. Belle hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. The devil's bargain. She took a deep breath, the scent of dust and desert sage filling her lungs, and stepped across the threshold. The interior of the shack was sparsely furnished, but surprisingly clean. A single cot stood against one wall, covered with a worn, but neatly folded, blanket. A small, wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a rough-hewn fireplace dominated the far wall. A few personal belongings were scattered about, a well-worn leather-bound book on the table, a chipped mug hanging from a hook near the fireplace, a pair of riding boots tucked neatly in a corner. It was a space that spoke of a solitary life, a life stripped down to the bare essentials. Rhodes lit a kerosene lamp, the flickering flame casting a warm, golden glow that chased away the shadows. He gestured towards one of the chairs. "Sit, Mrs. Carter." Belle sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched as he moved around the room, his movements fluid and graceful, despite his rugged exterior. He poured 2 glasses of water from a clay jug, offering her one. She accepted it, her fingers brushing against his, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. He sat down opposite her, his gaze intense, unwavering. "So, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low murmur, "let's talk about your debt." She took a sip of water, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. "What is it you want, Mr. Rhodes?" He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want the truth, Mrs. Carter. I want to know everything about your husband, about his debts, about you. The truth." It was a dangerous request. The truth was a tangled web of secrets and lies, of betrayals and regrets. The truth was something she'd been running from for months. But now, sitting across from this enigmatic gambler, in this humble shack on the edge of the desert, she felt a strange compulsion to confess, to lay bare her soul, to reveal the wounds that she had kept hidden for so long. "What makes you think I'll tell you the truth?" she asked, her voice challenging. He smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips. "Because, Mrs. Carter, I think you're tired of running. And I think you need someone to trust." His words struck a chord deep within her. He was right. She was tired of running. And she did need someone to trust. But could she trust him? A gambler, a cheat, a man with a shadowy past? It was a risk, a huge risk. But as she looked into his eyes, into the depths of that stormy gray, she saw something that gave her hope. She saw a flicker of understanding, of empathy, of something more. "All right, Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll tell you everything." She began to share her story, a tremor in her voice and hands, but the need to spill the truth was something she could no longer hold in. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Wind. Belle began her story, her voice hesitant at first, gaining strength as she delved into the shadowed corners of her past. She spoke of her life in St. Louis, of her upbringing in a well-to-do family, of her sheltered existence filled with piano lessons, embroidery circles, and the expectation of a suitable marriage. She described Thomas, her husband, as he had first appeared to her, charming, handsome, a successful businessman with a bright future. He had swept her off her feet, promising her a life of comfort and happiness. She spoke of their early years together, of the initial bliss that slowly faded, replaced by a growing unease, a sense of something amiss. She described Thomas's increasingly secretive behavior, his late nights, his unexplained absences, the subtle changes in his demeanor that she had initially dismissed as stress, as the pressures of his business. She spoke of the discovery, the devastating moment when she had stumbled upon the truth, the gambling debts, the lies, the betrayal. She described the confrontation, the anger, the tears, the shattered promises. And then, she spoke of his disappearance, of the sheriff's cursory investigation, of the whispered rumors that he had fled, leaving her to face the consequences of his actions. As she spoke, Rhodes listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer any judgment, any platitudes. He simply listened, and in his silence, Belle found a strange comfort, a release she hadn't realized she craved. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, creating an intimate, almost confessional atmosphere. "He left me with nothing," she said, her voice breaking slightly, the pain of the memory still raw, even after all these months. "No money, no explanation, just a mountain of debt and a ruined reputation." Rhodes leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his eyes filled with a surprising tenderness. "And you came to redemption to what? Escape?" Belle shook her head. "To survive. To try to pay off his debts, to clear his name, to find some peace." "And have you found it?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. "No," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I've found more trouble, more debt, more loneliness." He reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his. The touch was unexpected, sending a jolt of warmth through her. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle, reassuring. "You're not alone, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice soft, his gaze unwavering. "Not anymore." The words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within her. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his gaze, the empathy, the understanding. She saw a man who had known his own share of pain, of loss, of loneliness. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Rhodes?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you helping me?" He withdrew his hand, his gaze shifting to the flickering flame of the lamp. "Let's just say I have my own debts to repay," he said, his voice cryptic, his expression unreadable. She knew he wasn't talking about money. He was talking about something deeper, something more personal. She remembered the rumors she'd heard about him, the whispers of a past filled with tragedy, of a love lost, of a betrayal that had left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. "What happened to you?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. Something that looked like regret. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Then, he began to speak, his voice low and rough, his words carefully chosen. He spoke of a woman he had loved, a woman he had lost. He spoke of a betrayal, a double cross that had cost him everything. He spoke of his quest for vengeance, of his descent into darkness, of the years he had spent wandering the West, searching for something. Redemption, perhaps. Or maybe just oblivion. As he spoke, Belle listened, her heart aching for him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his voice, the burden he carried. She saw a man who was haunted by his past, just as she was. And in that shared pain, she found a connection, a bond that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. "I understand," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with empathy. "I understand what it's like to lose everything, to be betrayed, to be alone." He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. He saw the truth in her eyes, the sincerity, the compassion. He saw a woman who was strong, resilient, a woman who had survived her own trials, her own heartbreaks. He saw a kindred spirit. He reached across the table and took her hand again, his grip firm, reassuring. "We're both broken, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low murmur. "But maybe we can help each other heal." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. A promise. A hope. A gamble. Belle looked at him, at his rugged face, at his stormy eyes, at the vulnerability he tried so hard to conceal. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she was willing to take that gamble. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was forming between them. The silence stretched, comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that transcended words. The wind whispered outside, carrying the scent of desert sage and the promise of a new dawn. He didn't release her hand, and the silence was more telling than any grand confession. The feeling between them was undeniable. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom. The silence held, a comfortable weight punctuated only by the crackling of the lamp and the distant howl of a coyote. Belle felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. The fear was still there, the uncertainty about the future, but it was tempered by a growing sense of hope. A hope born of shared pain, of mutual understanding, of the unexpected connection she felt with this enigmatic gambler. Rhodes finally broke the silence, his voice a low murmur that seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind. "We need a plan, Mrs. Carter." Belle nodded, her gaze still locked on his. "A plan to do what?" "To clear your debts," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And to deal with the men who hold them." She knew who he was referring to. The vultures, as he had called them. The men who had been circling her since Thomas's disappearance, their offers of help thinly veiled propositions that made her skin crawl. Men like Silas Crandall, the owner of the Golden Nugget, a man with a reputation as ruthless as he was wealthy. And Jedediah Stone, the town's corrupt sheriff, a man who used his position of power to prey on the vulnerable. "They won't give up easily," she said, her voice laced with apprehension. Rhodes smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "They won't have a choice."
How?
She asked, her brow furrowing. "What can we possibly do?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, calculating. "We'll use their own greed against them, Mrs. Carter. We'll play their game, and we'll win." He outlined his plan, his voice low and steady, his words carefully chosen. It was a risky plan, a dangerous plan, a plan that relied on deception, on manipulation, on trust. He proposed a series of calculated gambles, a web of lies and half-truths designed to ensnare Crandall and Stone, to force them to relinquish their hold on her. As he spoke, Belle listened, her mind racing, weighing the risks, the potential consequences. It was madness, utter madness. But it was also brilliant, and it was the only chance she had. "It's dangerous," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We could end up dead." Rhodes met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "We're already dead, Mrs. Carter. We're just walking around." His words, stark and chilling, resonated with a truth she couldn't deny. She had been living a half-life, a shadow of her former self, haunted by the past, paralyzed by fear. This plan, as dangerous as it was, offered her a chance to reclaim her life, to fight back, to live again. "All right," she said, her voice steadier now, infused with a newfound resolve. "I'm in." He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her decision. "Good. We start tomorrow." He explained the details of the plan, the roles they would each play, the steps they would take. He would use his skills as a gambler, his reputation, his connections, to manipulate Crandall and Stone, to lure them into a trap. She would use her knowledge of Thomas's debts, of his secrets, of his weaknesses, to provide the bait. It was a delicate dance, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. One wrong move, one misstep, and they could lose everything. But as Belle looked at Rhodes, at his determined expression, at the fire that burned in his eyes, she felt a surge of confidence, of excitement. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We need to make this believable." "Believable?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, his gaze intense, his breath warm on her face. "We need to convince them that we're together. That you're mine." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning.
Meaning?
The possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver down her spine, but it wasn't a shiver of fear. It was a shiver of something else. Something she couldn't quite define. "You mean pretend to be lovers?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his eyes searching hers. "It's the only way to make them believe that you're no longer vulnerable, that you're protected. It'll throw them off balance, make them hesitate." It was a logical explanation, a strategic maneuver. But as Belle looked into his eyes, into the depths of that stormy gray, she saw something more. She saw a flicker of desire, a spark of something that mirrored her own growing attraction to him. She knew it was dangerous, this pretense. It was blurring the lines, crossing the boundaries. It was playing with fire. But she couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that drew her to him. She couldn't deny the way her heart raced when he looked at her, the way her breath caught in her throat when he touched her. "All right," she said, her voice a low murmur, her gaze locked on his. "We'll play the part." He smiled, a slow, sensual curve of his lips that sent a wave of heat through her. "Good," he said, his voice husky. "Because I intend to play it very well." He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. His touch was gentle, reverent, sending a shiver of anticipation through her. He leaned closer, his gaze locking onto hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and something else. Something that looked like tenderness. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It wasn't a passionate kiss, not yet. It was a promise, a prelude, a taste of what was to come. Belle closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the feel of his lips on hers, the warmth of his breath on her face. She knew it was a game, a pretense, a calculated move. But it felt real. It felt right. He lingered there, and the feeling, raw and overwhelming, washed over her. She knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 6. Beneath a Starlit Sky. The kiss lingered, a silent promise hanging in the air between them. Rhodes drew back slowly, his eyes searching hers, a question in their depths. Belle met his gaze, her own heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The pretense was already blurring the lines, the carefully constructed boundaries between them dissolving like sandcastles before a rising tide. "We should get some rest," Rhodes said, his voice husky, his breath still warm on her face. "We have a long day ahead of us." Belle nodded, her mind still reeling from the kiss, from the unexpected intensity of her reaction. She was playing with fire, she knew, but the warmth was intoxicating. He stood up, offering her his hand. She accepted it, his grip firm and reassuring. He led her to the cot, the only bed in the small shack. It was a narrow cot, barely big enough for one person, let alone two. "I'll sleep on the floor," Belle said, her voice stammering slightly, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and anticipation. Rhodes shook his head. "Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Carter. We're supposed to be together, remember? Crandall's men could be watching. We need to maintain the illusion." He was right, of course. It was a logical explanation, a strategic necessity. But as she looked at the narrow cot, at the prospect of spending the night in such close proximity to him, her heart skipped a beat. He extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the moon, a sliver of silver peeking through a crack in the boarded-up window, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Belle lay down on the cot, her body stiff, her senses on high alert. She could feel the warmth of the blanket, the rough texture of the mattress beneath her. She could hear the soft, even rhythm of Rhodes's breathing as he settled down beside her. The cot was small, their bodies pressed close together. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle rise and fall of his chest. She could smell the scent of him, a mixture of leather, gunpowder, and something else, something uniquely him. She lay there, perfectly still, acutely aware of his presence. She tried to focus on the plan, on the dangers that lay ahead, on the need to maintain the pretense. But her mind kept returning to the kiss, to the feel of his lips on hers, to the electric current that had surged through her. "Belle," he whispered, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. She turned her head, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She could see the outline of his face, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the glint of his eyes in the moonlight. "Yes," she whispered back. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice soft, concerned. She hesitated for a moment, considering her answer. She was afraid, of course. Afraid of the men they were up against, afraid of the risks they were taking, afraid of him. But she was also something else. Something she couldn't quite define. "A little," she admitted, her voice barely audible. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "Don't be," he said, his voice reassuring. "I won't let anything happen to you." His words, simple as they were, sent a wave of warmth through her. She believed him. She trusted him. It was a foolish trust, perhaps a reckless trust. But it was there nonetheless. She turned towards him, her body brushing against his. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her face, the steady beat of his heart against hers. "Thank you, Cass," she whispered, his name feeling strangely natural on her lips. He smiled, a faint curve of his lips visible in the moonlight. "Get some sleep, Belle," he said, his voice soft. "We have a big day tomorrow." She closed her eyes, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but it was overshadowed by something else. Something more. She was still in danger, still in debt, still playing a dangerous game. But she wasn't alone. She had Cass Rhodes by her side. And somehow, that made all the difference. She drifted off to sleep, her body pressed close to his, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. The moon climbed higher in the sky, bathing the small shack in its silvery light. Outside, the wind whispered through the desert, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of a new day. A day filled with danger, with deception, with possibilities. The proximity was unsettling, but her body relaxed into sleep, comforted by the steady sound of his presence. Chapter 7. Scars of the Soul. The first rays of dawn, pale and tentative, crept through the cracks in the boarded-up window, painting streaks of light across the dusty floor. Belle awoke slowly, her senses gradually returning to her. She was still lying on the narrow cot, her body pressed close to Rhodes's. His arm was draped around her waist, a heavy, possessive weight that was both comforting and unsettling. She lay there for a moment, perfectly still, savoring the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. She could smell the scent of him, the familiar mixture of leather, gunpowder, and sleep. She felt safe. A feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. A feeling that was both dangerous and addictive. She carefully extricated herself from his embrace, trying not to wake him. He stirred slightly, mumbling something unintelligible, but didn't open his eyes. She stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, her gaze sweeping over the small shack. The room was bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn, revealing the details she hadn't noticed the night before. She saw the scars. He was lying on his side, his back to her, his shirt partially unbuttoned, revealing a network of scars that crisscrossed his skin. They were old scars, faded and white, but they spoke of a violent past, of battles fought, of wounds endured. They were a roadmap of pain, a testament to a life lived on the edge. Belle felt a pang of sympathy. She had known he was a dangerous man, a man with a shadowy past. But seeing the physical evidence of his suffering, the scars that marked his body, brought a new level of understanding, of empathy. She thought of her own scars, the invisible wounds that she carried within her. The scars of betrayal, of loss, of loneliness. They weren't visible, like his, but they were just as real, just as painful. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that they were both scarred, both wounded, both broken. And perhaps that was what drew them together. That shared pain, that mutual understanding, that unspoken connection. She quietly dressed, pulling on the simple calico dress she had worn the day before. She splashed some water on her face from the clay jug, trying to wash away the lingering traces of sleep, of the kiss. Rhodes awoke as she was brushing her hair, his eyes slowly focusing on her. He sat up, stretching his arms above his head, his movements fluid and graceful, despite his rugged exterior. He looked different in the morning light. Softer, somehow. More vulnerable. "Morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, her voice soft, her gaze meeting his. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the understanding in her gaze, the empathy, the compassion. He knew she had seen his scars. He knew she understood. He didn't say anything, just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken connection between them. He stood up, pulling on his shirt, his movements deliberate, concealing the scars that marked his body. "We should get going," he said, his voice returning to its usual low rumble. "We have a lot to do." Belle nodded, her heart heavy with a mixture of emotions. She was afraid, yes, but she was also determined. She was ready to face whatever the day held, whatever challenges lay ahead. She was ready to play the game. They left the shack, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. The town of Redemption was already bustling with activity, the streets filled with the sounds of horses, wagons, and the chatter of people going about their daily lives. As they walked towards the Golden Nugget Saloon, Rhodes placed his hand on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that was both protective and intimate. It was a subtle reminder of the pretense, of the roles they were playing. But it felt real. It felt right. Belle knew that the day ahead would be dangerous, that they would be walking a tightrope, balancing between truth and deception, between risk and reward. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Cass Rhodes by her side. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She could almost pretend that this wasn't a charade. Almost. The charade was beginning to take root. Chapter 8. A Glimmer of Hope. The Golden Nugget Saloon was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. The usual crowd of miners, ranchers, and drifters were gathered around the tables, drinking, gambling, and gossiping. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and the ever-present dust. Rhodes steered Belle towards a table in a relatively quiet corner, his hand still resting on the small of her back. The gesture, though subtle, didn't go unnoticed. Eyes followed them, curious, speculative. Whispers rippled through the room. The pretense had begun. Silas Crandall, the owner of the saloon, was standing behind the bar, his beady eyes fixed on them. He was a large man, with a fleshy face, a receding hairline, and a perpetual scowl. He wore a fancy suit that strained at the seams, a diamond stickpin glinting in his cravat. He looked nervous. A good sign. Rhodes nodded curtly to Crandall, then pulled out a chair for Belle. She sat down, her posture straight, her head held high. She met Crandall's gaze, her own eyes unwavering, her expression carefully neutral. "Morning, Crandall," Rhodes said, his voice a low rumble that carried over the din of the saloon. Crandall nodded, his eyes darting between Rhodes and Belle.
Rhodes.
"Mrs. Carter." He said her name with a sneer, a subtle reminder of her indebted status. "We're here to discuss business," Rhodes said, his gaze locking onto Crandall's. Crandall hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He knew Rhodes's reputation, his skill as a gambler, his ruthlessness. He knew he was playing with fire. "What kind of business?" Crandall asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Rhodes smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The kind that involves settling debts." He placed a small, leather pouch on the table, the clink of coins echoing in the sudden silence. The sound drew the attention of everyone in the saloon. All eyes were on them, watching, waiting. "I understand Mrs. Carter owes you a considerable sum," Rhodes said, his voice casual, his gaze unwavering. Crandall swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the pouch. That's right. "I'm here to settle that debt," Rhodes said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "On her behalf." Crandall's eyes widened, his expression a mixture of surprise and greed. He looked at Belle, then back at Rhodes. "You're paying her debt?" Rhodes nodded. "Consider it a gift. To my woman." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "My woman." The possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver down Belle's spine. It was part of the pretense, of course, but it felt real. It felt thrilling. Crandall's gaze lingered on Belle, his eyes filled with a mixture of lust and resentment. He had wanted her, had tried to use her debt to force her into his bed. But now, she was untouchable. She belonged to Rhodes. "I don't understand," Crandall stammered, his composure cracking. Rhodes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in Mrs. Carter's well-being. And I don't appreciate vultures circling around what's mine." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Crandall paled, his hands trembling slightly. He knew he was outmatched. He knew he had lost. "All right, Rhodes," Crandall said, his voice defeated. "The debt is settled." Rhodes smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes.
"Good.
Now, about that other matter," he was referring to Jedediah Stone, the corrupt sheriff. "The second part of their plan. The more dangerous part." Crandall nodded, his eyes filled with fear. I'll send word to Stone. He'll be here soon." Rhodes stood up, pulling Belle up with him. His hand rested on her waist, a possessive gesture that sent a wave of heat through her. "We'll be waiting," Rhodes said, his voice low and steady. They left the Golden Nugget, stepping out into the bright sunlight. Belle felt a sense of relief wash over her. The first part of their plan had been successful. They had cleared her debt with Crandall. They had won. But the game was far from over. Stone was still out there, a dangerous, unpredictable opponent. And Belle knew that the stakes were about to get much higher. There was relief and fear, mingling and separating, as Belle tried to anticipate what would happen next. Chapter 9. The Rustler's Trail. The air outside the Golden Nugget felt cleaner, fresher, as if the very act of leaving Crandall's presence had lifted a weight from Belle's shoulders. Yet, the tension remained, a tight knot in her stomach, a constant reminder of the precarious game they were playing. "What now?" Belle asked, her voice low, her gaze searching Rhodes's face. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the street, his senses on high alert. He seemed to be listening for something, watching for something, his body tense, ready for anything. "We wait," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "And we prepare." He led her away from the main thoroughfare, towards a less crowded side street. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the morning sun. Belle felt a growing sense of unease. She had trusted Rhodes, had placed her faith in his plan, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The ease with which Crandall had capitulated, the fear in his eyes, it all seemed too easy. "What aren't you telling me, Cass?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped, turning to face her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, searching hers. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. "There's more to this than just your debts, Belle," he finally said, his voice cryptic, his expression unreadable. "Much more." She felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the rolling hills met the vast, open expanse of the desert. "Stone isn't just corrupt, Belle. He's dangerous. He's involved in things. Things that go far beyond redemption." "What kind of things?" She pressed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of warning and regret.
Rustling, Belle.
Large-scale rustling. And murder. The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Rustling. Murder. She had known Stone was corrupt, that he used his position of power to prey on the vulnerable. But this was something else entirely. This was evil. "And Thomas?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Was he involved?" Rhodes nodded, his expression grim.
He was.
Up to his neck. He was Stone's bookkeeper. He kept track of the profits. Belle felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Thomas. Her husband. The man she had loved. The man she had trusted. A rustler. A murderer. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow, a betrayal that cut deeper than any she had imagined. "And you knew this all along?" she asked, her voice laced with accusation. He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I suspected. I didn't know for sure until I saw Thomas's books. The ones you found." She remembered the hidden ledger, the cryptic entries, the numbers that hadn't made sense to her at the time. Now they were chillingly clear. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and hurt. He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. His touch was gentle, reassuring, but it couldn't erase the pain, the betrayal. "I wanted to protect you, Belle," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't want you to know the truth."
"Not yet. Protect me?"
she scoffed, pulling away from his touch. "By lying to me? By manipulating me? By keeping you alive," he corrected, his voice firm. "Stone would have killed you if he'd known you had those books. He would have killed you if he'd known you were a threat." His words, stark and chilling, resonated with a truth she couldn't deny. She had been in danger, and Rhodes he had saved her. Again.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice softer now, the anger replaced by a growing sense of confusion. "Why are you doing this, Cass? Why are you risking your life for me?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire, tenderness, and something else. Something that looked like love. "Because you're worth it, Belle," he said, his voice a low murmur, his breath warm on her face.
"Because I care about you."
The words hung in the air, heavy, with unspoken meaning. He cared about her. More than he should. More than was safe. Belle felt her heart skip a beat. She had known, on some level, that their connection was growing, that the pretense was becoming real. But hearing him say the words, seeing the truth in his eyes, it was overwhelming. She didn't know what to say, how to respond. She was still reeling from the revelations about Thomas, about Stone, about everything. She was confused, uncertain, afraid. But she also felt something else. Something more. She felt a flicker of hope, a spark of desire, a yearning for something she hadn't dared to dream of. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It wasn't a passionate kiss, not yet. It was a question, a plea, a promise. She closed her eyes, leaning into the kiss, her body responding to his touch, her heart overriding her mind. She knew it was dangerous, this feeling, this connection. But she couldn't deny it. She couldn't resist it. He pulled back slightly, his gaze searching hers. "We need to go," he said, his voice husky. "Stone will be waiting." Belle nodded silently and wondered just how deep this went, as her mind was overwhelmed by the implications. Chapter 10. Broken Trust. The meeting with Sheriff Jedediah Stone took place not in the Golden Nugget, but in Stone's own office, a cramped, dimly lit space in the back of the town's jailhouse. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, sweat, and fear. Stone was a tall, thin man with a gaunt face, a receding hairline, and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a starched white shirt, a BOLO tie, and a gun belt that sagged low on his hips. He looked nervous, but also dangerous, like a cornered rattlesnake, ready to strike. Crandall was also present, standing nervously in a corner, his eyes darting between Stone and Rhodes. He looked like a man who had just made a very bad deal. "Rhodes," Stone said, his voice a low growl, his gaze fixed on the gambler. "What's the meaning of this?" Rhodes stood his ground, his posture relaxed, his hands resting casually on his hips. "I believe you have something that belongs to Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice calm, his gaze unwavering. Stone's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rhodes smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't play coy with me, Stone. We both know you were involved with Thomas Carter. We both know about the rustling. And we both know you have his ledger." Stone's face paled, his composure cracking. He glanced at Crandall, his eyes filled with accusation. Crandall cowered, shrinking back into the corner. "That's a lie," Stone said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know anything about any ledger." Rhodes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a page from Thomas's ledger, the one Belle had found hidden in their house. The one that detailed the transactions, the payments, the murders. "This look familiar, Stone?" Rhodes asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Stone stared at the paper, his eyes wide with fear. He recognized it, of course. It was his death warrant. Where did you get that?" Stone stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "From Mrs. Carter," Rhodes said, his gaze shifting to Belle. "She found it among her husband's belongings." Stone turned to Belle, his eyes filled with hatred. You bitch," he hissed, his voice venomous. "You were supposed to be dead." Belle met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering, her expression defiant. She had been afraid, yes, but she was no longer the grieving widow, the helpless victim. She was something else now, something stronger. "I'm still here, Stone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." Stone lunged at her, his hand reaching for his gun. But Rhodes was faster. He moved with lightning speed, intercepting Stone, his hand clamping down on the sheriff's wrist. "I wouldn't do that, Stone," Rhodes said, his voice low and dangerous. "Unless you want to end up like your partner." The two men struggled, their bodies locked in a tense embrace. The air crackled with violence. Belle watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer she kept hidden in her reticule. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Belle gasped, her eyes wide with horror. She saw Stone slump to the ground, his body convulsing, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. She looked at Rhodes, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock and relief. He was standing over Stone, his gun still smoking in his hand. He had shot him. He had killed him. Cass, she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes filled with regret. He had done what he had to do. He had protected her. But at what cost? He holstered his gun, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked tired, worn down, haunted. "It's over, Belle," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's finally over." But it wasn't over. Not really. Crandall, who had witnessed the entire scene, was terrified. He knew he was next. He knew his life was in danger. "Please, Rhodes," Crandall pleaded, his voice trembling. "Don't kill me. I'll do anything. I'll tell you everything." Rhodes looked at Crandall, his eyes cold, calculating. He knew Crandall was a coward, a weakling, a man who would betray anyone to save his own skin. "Tell me where the rest of the ledger is," Rhodes said, his voice demanding. Crandall hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the room, as if looking for an escape. But there was no escape. It's hidden," Crandall stammered. "In a safe. In Stone's house." Rhodes nodded. "Take us there." Crandall led them to Stone's house, a modest dwelling on the outskirts of town. He opened the safe, revealing the rest of the ledger, along with a stack of cash. Rhodes took the ledger, his gaze fixed on the pages filled with Thomas's meticulous handwriting. He saw the names, the dates, the amounts. He saw the evidence of a life built on lies, on greed, on blood. He felt a wave of disgust. Not just for Thomas, but for himself. For the life he had led, for the choices he had made, for the darkness that still lingered within him. The scene left her feeling hollow. He had done it. He had saved her, but at the expense of another shattered life. The feeling was bitter. Chapter 11. The Heart's Reckoning. The weight of the ledger in Rhodes's hands felt heavier than it should, each page a testament to betrayal and a life wrongly lived. He glanced at Belle, her face pale in the dim light of Stone's ransacked office. He saw the questions in her eyes, the unspoken accusations, the disappointment. He had killed a man, even if it was in her defense, and he knew that act had irrevocably changed something between them. "We should go," he said, his voice rough, breaking the silence that had settled over them. He needed to get out of his house, away from the stench of death and deceit. Belle nodded, her movements stiff, her gaze fixed on the floor. She followed him out of the house, Crandall trailing behind them like a whipped dog, his pleas for mercy echoing in the empty street. Rhodes ignored him. He had what he needed. Crandall was no longer a threat. He could disappear, rot in jail. It didn't matter. The ledger was the key, the evidence that would expose the entire rustling operation, the network of corruption that had stretched far beyond redemption. He didn't know what he was going to do with it yet. Turn it over to the authorities? To whom? The new sheriff? Who was to say he wouldn't be just as corrupt as Stone? He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what came next. They returned to his shack, the small, dilapidated dwelling feeling strangely empty. The intimacy they had shared there, the fragile bond that had formed between them, felt broken, shattered by the violence, by the revelations, by the truth. Belle sat down on the cot, her body trembling slightly. She looked lost, vulnerable. He wanted to comfort her, to hold her, to tell her that everything would be all right. But he couldn't. He didn't know if it would be. He placed the ledger on the table, the leather cover worn and stained, the pages filled with the ghosts of Thomas's victims. He felt a wave of nausea. He had been so focused on protecting Belle, on avenging his own past, that he hadn't stopped to consider the consequences. "What happens now?" Belle asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the ledger. Rhodes sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Belle. I honestly don't know." He sat down beside her, the cot creaking under his weight. He wanted to reach out to her, to touch her, but he hesitated. He felt unworthy. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and filled with regret. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry for everything." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, disappointment, and something else. Something that looked like understanding. It wasn't your fault, Cass, she said, her voice soft. You did what you had to do. But I killed him, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I took a life. And I enjoyed it. The confession hung in the air, heavy and stark. He had revealed his darkest secret, the part of him he kept hidden, even from himself. The part of him that reveled in violence, that craved revenge. Belle didn't flinch, didn't recoil. She simply looked at him. And in her gaze, he saw not judgment, but compassion. We all have darkness within us, Cass, she said, her voice gentle. It's what we choose to do with it that matters. Her words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep within him. She was right.
He had a choice.
He could succumb to the darkness, become the monster he feared he was. Or he could choose a different path. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Her hand was warm, soft, a comforting anchor in the storm that raged within him. I don't want to be that man, Belle, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I don't want to be him. She squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. Then don't be, she said, her voice firm. Choose something else.
Choose me.
The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Choose me. It was an invitation, a plea, a promise. A promise of a different life, a different future, a different him. He looked at her beautiful face, at her kind eyes, at the strength and resilience that shone through her vulnerability. He saw hope.
He saw love.
He saw a future he hadn't dared to dream of. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with all the unspoken emotions that swirled between them. It was a kiss of forgiveness, of redemption, of love. It wasn't a perfect love, not yet. It was a love born of pain, of betrayal, of violence. But it was real. It was theirs. He pulled back slightly, his gaze searching hers. Are you sure, Belle? He asked, his voice husky. Are you sure you want this?
Me?
She nodded and spoke softly. More than anything. The words were a balm on his soul, a resolution and a challenge. Chapter 12. Crossroads of Destiny. Belle's words, more than anything, echoed in Cass's mind, a soothing balm against the turmoil that had been his constant companion. He held her gaze, seeing the unwavering conviction in her eyes, the depth of feeling that mirrored his own. He knew this was a turning point, a crossroads where their intertwined destinies would either blossom into a shared future or wither under the weight of their pasts. We can't stay here, Belle, he said, his voice low, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Redemption holds too many ghosts, too many dangers. She nodded, her hand still clasped in his. Where will we go? He hadn't thought that far ahead. His focus had been solely on protecting her, on settling the score, on surviving. But now, with the promise of a future with Belle, a future he hadn't dared to imagine, he needed a plan, a destination, a purpose. Somewhere new, he said, his mind racing, considering the possibilities. Somewhere we can start over. Somewhere safe. He thought of California, of the stories he'd heard of vast, fertile lands, of opportunities for a fresh start. He thought of Montana, of the rugged mountains, the open spaces, the freedom. We could go west, he suggested, his eyes searching hers. To California. Or north. To Montana. Belle considered his words, her brow furrowing slightly. California, that's where Thomas always talked about going, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. He had dreams. Of owning a ranch. Of a better life. Cass felt a pang of guilt. He had robbed her of that dream, of that future, even if it had been a future built on lies. We don't have to go there, he said, his voice gentle. We can go anywhere. We can build our own dream. She smiled, a faint, tentative smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. What kind of dream, Cass? He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face. A simple dream, Belle. A quiet life. A home. A family. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A family. He had never allowed himself to dream of such a thing. He had always believed he was too damaged, too dangerous, too unworthy. But with Belle, with her love, with her forgiveness, he felt a flicker of hope. A possibility. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his cheekbones, the scar that bisected his eyebrow. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the longing, the love. "I like that dream," she said, her voice soft, her gaze unwavering. He kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that sealed their pact, their shared dream, their future. It was a kiss of hope, of promise, of a new beginning. They spent the rest of the day making plans, discussing their options, weighing the risks. They decided to leave Redemption the following morning, to head west, towards California. They would sell the few belongings Belle had left, gather supplies, and disappear. They burned Thomas's ledger, the flames consuming the evidence of his crimes, of his betrayal, of their past. It was a symbolic act, a cleansing, a letting go. As the sun set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the desert landscape, they stood outside the small shack, their arms wrapped around each other, their gazes fixed on the horizon. "Are you afraid?" Cass asked, his voice a low murmur against her hair. Belle shook her head. "Not anymore," she said, her voice firm. "I'm with you. That's all that matters." He held her tighter, his heart overflowing with love. He had found her, his redemption, his future. He had been a gambler, a cheat, a killer.
But he was also something else now.
Something more. He was a man in love. And he would do anything to protect that love, to build that future, to deserve her. As darkness fell, blanketing the desert in a velvety cloak of stars, they turned and went inside, closing the door on their past, on their pain, on redemption. They were leaving it all behind, embarking on a new journey, a new adventure, a new life. Together. Their future was unwritten, but in the embrace, there was a shared commitment that was as undeniable as it was daunting. Chapter 13. Echoes of Regret. The journey west was arduous, a grueling test of endurance that mirrored the emotional landscape Belle and Cass were navigating. They traveled by horseback, avoiding the main trails, sticking to the less traveled paths, their faces weathered by the sun and wind, their bodies weary from the long days in the saddle. The vast, unforgiving desert stretched before them, a seemingly endless expanse of sand, rock, and scrub, broken only by the occasional oasis or the distant silhouette of a mountain range. They spoke little, their conversations sparse and practical, focused on the necessities of survival, finding water, rationing their supplies, choosing a safe place to camp for the night. The intimacy they had shared in the small shack in Redemption felt distant, replaced by a quiet understanding, a shared determination to reach their destination, to start anew. But the silence was also filled with unspoken emotions, with the echoes of their pasts, with the weight of their choices. Belle often found herself thinking of Thomas, of the life they had shared, of the dreams that had been shattered. She felt a mixture of sadness, anger, and regret. Regret for the choices she had made, for the years she had wasted, for the love she had lost. She also thought of Cass, of his past, of the violence he had witnessed, of the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his voice, the burden he carried. She knew he was trying to change, to be a better man, to deserve her. But she also knew that the past was not easily erased, that the shadows still lingered, that the darkness still threatened. One evening, as they sat around a small campfire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces, Belle broke the silence. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames.
Cass knew what she was referring to.
The killing of Stone, the violence, the darkness. He looked at her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, searching hers. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. "Yes," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "I regret it. Every day." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any excuses, any justifications. He simply admitted it. And in his honesty, Belle found a strange comfort. "It haunts me," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. The faces, the screams, the blood. He closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. He was reliving the memories, the nightmares, the trauma. Belle reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle, reassuring. I know, she said, her voice soft. I understand. She didn't understand. Not completely. She hadn't witnessed the violence, hadn't experienced the trauma. But she had seen the scars, the pain, the regret. And she knew, on some level, what he was going through. I'm trying to change, Belle, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm trying to be a better man. For you. She squeezed his hand, her gaze unwavering. I know you are, Cass, she said, her voice firm. And I believe in you. Her words, simple as they were, gave him strength. Hope. He needed her love, her forgiveness, her belief in him. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with gratitude, with love. It was a kiss of healing, of redemption, of a new beginning. They sat there for a long time, their arms wrapped around each other, their bodies pressed close, the warmth of the fire chasing away the chill of the night. The stars twinkled above them, a vast, silent audience to their journey. A journey not just across the desert, but across the landscape of their souls. A journey towards healing, towards forgiveness, towards love. The desert was a mirror and an unforgiving judge. But as they pressed on, there was a shared understanding in the quiet spaces. Chapter 14. A Dance with Danger. Their journey was not without peril. The West was a wild, untamed land, filled with dangers, both natural and man-made. They encountered rattlesnakes, scorpions, and the occasional coyote, their presence a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this harsh environment. They endured scorching heat, bone-chilling nights, and the ever-present threat of thirst. But the greatest danger came, as it often did, from their own kind. One afternoon, as they were riding through a narrow canyon, they were ambushed by a band of outlaws, a ragtag group of men with hard eyes and weathered faces, their clothes dusty and torn, their weapons drawn and ready. They were clearly after the horses, the supplies, and anything else they could get their hands on. Stay behind me, Belle, Cass said, his voice low and calm, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Belle nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer she kept hidden in her saddlebag. She was afraid, yes, but she was also determined. She wouldn't go down without a fight. The outlaws surrounded them, their leader, a burly man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, stepping forward. Well, the outlaw leader sneered. What have we here? A couple of lovebirds, lost in the wilderness? Cass didn't flinch, didn't back down. He met the outlaw's gaze, his own eyes narrowed, his expression cold and calculating. We don't want any trouble, Cass said, his voice steady, his hand still resting on his gun. Just let us pass. The outlaw laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the canyon. Let you pass? I don't think so. We're going to take your horses, your supplies, and your woman. His gaze lingered on Belle, his eyes filled with lust and malice. He saw her fear, but he also saw her defiance. Cass's hand tightened on his gun. You touch her, and you're a dead man. The outlaw laughed again. Big words, for a man outnumbered. I think we'll take our chances. He signaled to his men, and they moved closer, their weapons raised. It was a standoff, a tense moment that could explode into violence at any second. Belle knew they were in trouble. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But she also knew that Cass wouldn't give up. He would fight to protect her, even if it cost him his life. Suddenly, Cass moved. With lightning speed, he drew his gun and fired, his shots echoing through the canyon. Two of the outlaws fell, their bodies slumping to the ground. The others opened fire, a hail of bullets whizzing past Cass and Belle. They took cover behind some rocks, returning fire, the sounds of gunfire deafening. It was a chaotic, desperate fight, a struggle for survival. Belle fired her derringer, her hand trembling, her aim unsure. She hit one of the outlaws in the shoulder, wounding him, but not killing him. Cass fought with a fierce determination, his movements precise and deadly. He was a skilled gunman, a veteran of countless battles, a man who knew how to survive. One by one, the outlaws fell, their bodies littering the canyon floor. The leader, the last one standing, turned to flee, but Cass shot him in the back, the bullet finding its mark. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of Cass and Belle. They had survived. They had won. But at what cost? Cass emerged from behind the rocks, his gun still smoking in his hand, his face grim, his eyes filled with regret. He had killed again. He had taken lives. He had survived. Belle stood up, her body trembling, her legs weak. She looked at the bodies, at the blood, at the carnage. She felt the wave of nausea. "Are you all right?" Cass asked, his voice concerned, his gaze searching hers. Belle nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I think so." He holstered his gun, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked over to her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. "It's over, Belle," he said, his voice soft, his breath warm on her face. "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not really. The violence, the bloodshed, the trauma, it would stay with them. It would haunt them. It would shape them. They buried the bodies, a grim, silent task that left them both feeling empty. They gathered their belongings, their horses, and continued their journey. The landscape seemed to reflect their mood, the sun setting in a blaze of fiery colors, painting the sky with hues of red, orange, and blood. They had survived, yes, but the dance with danger had left its mark. It was a jarring reminder. They were not immune to the perils of the world they were attempting to make home in. Chapter 15. The Unforgiving Land. The landscape began to change as they moved further west, the harsh, arid desert gradually giving way to rolling hills, dotted with patches of green. The air felt cooler, fresher, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They were approaching California, their destination, their hope. But the journey had taken its toll, both physically and emotionally. They were both exhausted, their bodies weary, their spirits bruised. The encounter with the outlaws had shaken them, reminding them of the ever-present dangers of the West, of the fragility of life. They spoke even less now, their silence filled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their experiences, with the uncertainty of their future. They were close to their destination, yes, but they were also far apart. The violence, the bloodshed, the trauma had created a distance between them, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. One evening, as they were camped beside a small stream, the water gurgling softly over smooth stones, Belle noticed a change in Cass. He was withdrawn, distant, his eyes filled with a darkness she hadn't seen before. He sat apart from her, staring into the campfire, his face grim, his body tense. "Cass?" she said, her voice soft, her concern evident. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear her. He was lost in his own thoughts, in his own demons. She moved closer to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, his body stiffening. "Cass, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. He looked at her, his eyes, usually the color of a stormy sky, now seemed dull, lifeless. He looked broken. "I can't do this, Belle," he said, his voice a low, hoarse whisper. "I can't escape it." She knew what he was referring to. The violence, the killing, the darkness within him. He was struggling, battling his demons, and losing. "Don't say that, Cass," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We're almost there. We can start over. We can be happy." He shook his head, his face contorted with pain. "It's no use, Belle.
I'm tainted. I'm damned.
I'll never be good enough for you." His words, filled with self-loathing, with despair, cut her to the core. She had seen his vulnerability, his pain, his regret. But she had also seen his strength, his resilience, his love. "That's not true, Cass," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. You are good enough. You are everything to me. She reached out and cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the lines of his cheekbones, the scar that bisected his eyebrow. She saw the tears welling up in his eyes, the silent tears of a man who had endured too much, who had lost his way. Don't give up, Cass, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Don't give up on us. Don't give up on yourself. He leaned into her touch, his body trembling, his defenses crumbling. He buried his face in her shoulder, his sobs muffled by her hair. She held him close, her arms wrapped around him, her body providing a refuge, a safe haven from the storm that raged within him. She didn't speak, didn't offer any platitudes, any false reassurances. She simply held him, and in her silence, he found comfort,
Strength. Hope.
They stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the campfire, the gurgling of the stream, and the soft sobs of a man who was finally breaking down. As the night wore on, his sobs subsided, his breathing becoming more even, his body relaxing. He had cried himself out, exhausted, drained, but also cleansed. He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his face streaked with tears. He looked vulnerable, but also stronger. I'm sorry, Belle, he said, his voice hoarse. I lost it. She smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. It's all right, Cass, she said, her voice soft. We all break down sometimes. He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle, reverent. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. For everything. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with love. It was a kiss of healing, of forgiveness, of hope. They had weathered another storm, another challenge, another test. They were still scarred, still wounded, but also stronger. Together. The land was unforgiving, but their bond was beginning to show the resilience that only hardship can forge. Chapter 16. Redemption's Call. They finally reached California, crossing the border into a land that promised a fresh start, a new beginning. The landscape was breathtaking, a tapestry of rolling hills, lush valleys, and towering redwood forests, a stark contrast to the arid desert they had left behind. The air was clean and crisp, carrying the scent of pine, wildflowers, and the distant roar of the Pacific Ocean. They found a small, secluded valley nestled between gentle hills, with a clear, sparkling stream running through it. It was a peaceful, idyllic place, far from the hustle and bustle of civilization, a sanctuary. This is it, Cass said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and awe. This is where we'll build our home. Belle nodded, her heart filled with hope. She could see it too. A small cabin, a garden, a few animals, a simple life. A life free from violence, from fear, from the past. They set to work immediately, their days filled with the hard, physical labor of building their new life. They felled trees, cleared land, and slowly, painstakingly, began to construct their cabin. It was a small, modest structure, but it was theirs. Built with their own hands, with their own sweat, with their own love. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, their silence filled with a comfortable understanding, a shared purpose. They were rebuilding not just a home, but their lives, their relationship, their souls. As the days turned into weeks, the cabin began to take shape, its walls rising, its roof providing shelter, its windows offering a view of the future. They planted a garden, the seeds sprouting, the plants growing, a symbol of hope, of new life. They also started to heal. The physical labor, the fresh air, the peaceful surroundings, it all helped to soothe their wounds, to erase the scars, to mend their broken spirits. Cass seemed to be changing. The darkness that had haunted him, the violence that had threatened to consume him, it was receding. He was still quiet, still reserved, but there was a lightness in his eyes, a gentleness in his touch, a peace in his soul. Belle, too, was changing. The fear, the sadness, the regret, it was fading. She was still haunted by the past, yes, but she was also looking forward. To the future. To their life together. One evening, As they sat on the porch of their newly built cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, Cass spoke. "I've been thinking, Belle," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "About redemption." Belle felt a chill run down her spine. Redemption. The town they had left behind, the town filled with ghosts, with pain, with memories. "What about it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He turned to her, his eyes, the color of a clear sky now, searching hers. "I need to go back," he said, his voice firm. She felt a surge of fear. "Go back."
Why?
He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His hand was warm, strong, reassuring. "To make things right," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "To finish what I started." She knew what he was referring to. The rustling operation, the corruption, the injustice. He wanted to expose it all, to bring the guilty to justice, to redeem himself. "It's too dangerous, Cass," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You could be killed." He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "I have to do this, Belle. For myself. For us." He explained his plan. He would return to redemption, not as Cass Rhodes, the gambler, the killer, but as someone else. He would gather evidence, work with the new sheriff, and bring down the remaining members of Stone's gang. It was a risky plan, a dangerous plan, but she understood. She knew he had to do this, to confront his past, to make amends, to find peace. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. He shook his head.
No, Belle.
"It's too dangerous. You need to stay here. You need to be safe." She wanted to argue, to protest, but she knew he was right. She would be a liability, a distraction, a weakness. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with love, with promise, with farewell. "I promise," he said, his voice husky. "I'll come back to you, Belle. I swear it." He left the following morning, riding away on his horse, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Belle watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of fear, sadness, and pride. He was going back to redemption, to face his demons, to redeem himself. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that he would succeed. Her heart ached at the thought of separation, but there was a solemn acceptance that this had to be done. Chapter 17. The Ties That Bind.
Belle waited.
Days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into a long, agonizing month. She kept herself busy, tending to the garden, caring for the animals they had acquired, maintaining the cabin. But her mind was constantly on Cass, her thoughts filled with worry, with fear, with hope. She missed him terribly. His presence, his touch, his love. The cabin, their sanctuary, felt empty without him. The silence, once a comfort, now seemed oppressive. She found herself staring at the horizon, searching for any sign of his return, her heart leaping with anticipation at every distant sound, only to sink with disappointment when it turned out to be nothing. She wrote him letters, pouring out her thoughts, her feelings, her love, knowing that he would likely never receive them. It was a way to connect with him, to keep his memory alive, to sustain her hope. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be, could it? As the rider drew closer, she recognized the familiar figure, the way he sat in the saddle, the grace of his movements. It was him. It was Cass. She jumped up, running towards him, her heart overflowing with joy, with relief, with love. He dismounted, his face weary, his clothes dusty, but his eyes were filled with a light, a peace that she hadn't seen before. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. It was a long, silent embrace, filled with unspoken emotions, with relief, with gratitude, with love. "You came back," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, her tears flowing freely. "I promised I would," he said, his voice husky, his arms tightening around her. They stood there for a long time, their embrace a lifeline, a connection, a reunion. He had been gone for over a month that had felt like an eternity. He had faced danger, had confronted his past, had risked his life. But he had succeeded. He told her everything, his voice low and steady, his words carefully chosen. He had returned to redemption, posing as a drifter, a nobody. He had gathered evidence, working in secret, slowly, painstakingly, piecing together the puzzle of Stone's operation. He had found allies, surprisingly, in unexpected places. The new sheriff, a young, idealistic man named Elias, had been eager to clean up the town, to restore justice. And Crandall, surprisingly, had cooperated, fearing for his life, desperate to redeem himself. Together, they had exposed the remaining members of Stone's gang, bringing them to justice, dismantling the rustling operation, and restoring order to redemption. It had been dangerous, yes, but he had been careful, methodical, and successful. He had redeemed himself. "It's over, Belle," he said, his voice filled with relief. "It's finally over." But it wasn't just about redemption, about the rustling, about justice. It was about him, about his past, about his demons, about his soul. He had faced his fears, had confronted his darkness, and had emerged victorious. He had healed. "I'm proud of you, Cass," Belle said, her voice filled with admiration, with love. He smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Belle," he said, his voice soft. "For everything." They returned to the cabin, their sanctuary, their home. They had both been through so much, had endured so much, had changed so much. But their love had endured. It had grown stronger. It had deepened. They were no longer the broken, haunted individuals who had met in the Golden Nugget Saloon. There was something else now. Something more. They were a couple. A family. A future. As the night settled in, they held one another, and there was a completeness that had been previously fragmented. Chapter 18. A flicker of faith. Life in the valley settled into a peaceful rhythm. The days were filled with the simple routines of rural life, tending to the garden, caring for the animals, making repairs to the cabin, exploring the surrounding hills and forests. The nights were filled with quiet conversations, shared meals, and the comfort of each other's presence. Cass and Belle were happy. Not a boisterous, exuberant happiness, but a quiet, contented happiness, a happiness born of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of deep, abiding love. They had both changed, transformed by their experiences, by their journey, by each other. Cass was no longer the haunted, brooding gambler, the man weighed down by his past, by his darkness. He was still quiet, still reserved, but there was a lightness in his step, a sparkle in his eyes, a peace in his soul. Belle, too, had changed. The fear, the sadness, the regret had faded, replaced by a strength, a resilience, a joy she hadn't known before. She was no longer the grieving widow, the helpless victim. She was a survivor, a partner, a woman in love. They rarely spoke of the past, of redemption, of Thomas, of Stone. It was as if that chapter of their lives had been closed, sealed, put away. They were focused on the present, on their life together, on their future. But the past, as it often does, had a way of resurfacing. One afternoon, as Belle was working in the garden, she noticed a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner of the cabin. She didn't recognize it, hadn't seen it before. It was old, worn, its surface covered in a layer of dust. Curiosity piqued, she opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of letters. Old letters, yellowed with age, their edges frayed, their ink faded. They were addressed to Cass. From a woman named Sarah. Belle's heart skipped a beat.
Sarah.
She remembered Cass mentioning her, briefly, back in Redemption. The woman he had loved, the woman he had lost, the woman who had betrayed him. She hesitated for a moment, her conscience warring with her curiosity. These were private letters, personal letters, letters that were not meant for her eyes. But she couldn't resist. She had to know. She carefully unfolded one of the letters, her hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, the words filled with love, with longing, with pain. As she read the letter, she began to understand. Sarah hadn't betrayed Cass. She had been forced,
Coerced.
threatened. She had been protecting him, sacrificing her own happiness, her own life, to save him. The letter detailed the circumstances, the threats, the danger. Sarah had been caught in a web of deceit, of violence, of corruption. She had been used as a pawn, a victim. Belle felt a wave of sadness, of empathy, of anger. She understood, now, the depth of Cass's pain, the source of his darkness. He had blamed himself, had carried the burden of guilt, of regret, for years, believing that Sarah had betrayed him, when, in reality, she had loved him. She read through the rest of the letters, her heart aching for Cass, for Sarah, for the tragedy of their lost love. The letters painted a picture of a desperate woman, trapped in a hopeless situation, clinging to the memory of her love for Cass, her faith in him. Belle carefully placed the letters back in the box, her mind reeling. She had to tell Cass. He had to know the truth. She found him down by the stream, skipping stones across the water, his face relaxed, his eyes peaceful. She hesitated for a moment, reluctant to shatter his serenity. But she knew she had to do it. "Cass," she said, her voice soft, her approach cautious. He turned to her, his eyes, the color of a clear sky, searching hers. He saw the seriousness in her expression, the concern in her eyes. "What is it, Belle?" he asked, his voice calm. She held out the box, her hand trembling slightly. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "In the cabin." He took the box, his brow furrowing. He recognized it, of course. It was Sarah's box, the box he had kept hidden, locked away, a reminder of his past, of his pain. He opened the box, his fingers tracing the familiar letters, his face unreadable. He knew what they contained. He had read them countless times, years ago, each word a dagger to his heart. "I read them, Cass," Belle said, her voice soft, her gaze unwavering. "I know the truth." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with surprise, with confusion, with pain. "The truth?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "About Sarah," Belle said, her voice gentle. "She didn't betray you, Cass. She loved you. She was protecting you." She explained what she had read, the threats, the coercion, the sacrifice. She told him everything. Cass listened, his body stiff, his face pale. He was reliving the past, the pain, the guilt, but this time with a new understanding, a new perspective. He closed his eyes, his body trembling, his tears flowing freely. He had been wrong. He had misjudged her. He had blamed her, when all along, she had been his savior. Belle reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Her touch was gentle, reassuring, loving. "I'm so sorry, Cass," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto hers. He saw the compassion in her eyes, the understanding, the love. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He buried his face in her hair, his sobs muffled. He had carried the burden of guilt, of regret, for so long. He had believed he was unworthy of love, of happiness. But now he knew the truth. And the truth had set him free. This revelation was another turning point, and Belle was there, a witness and a balm. Chapter 19. The Serpent's Kiss. The revelation about Sarah brought a new depth of understanding and healing to Cass and Belle's relationship. The past, though still a presence, no longer held the same power over Cass. He had mourned Sarah, truly mourned her, for the first time, acknowledging her sacrifice, her love, and his own loss. Life in the valley continued, peaceful and serene. They had built a life together, a home, a sanctuary. But even in paradise, shadows can lurk. One day, a stranger arrived. He rode into their valley on a tired horse, his clothes dusty, his face weathered, his eyes shifty. He introduced himself as Jed, a prospector, looking for a place to rest and resupply. Cass was wary, his instincts honed by years of living on the edge. There was something about the man that didn't sit right, something false, something dangerous. Belle, however, was more trusting, more welcoming. She offered the stranger food and water, a place to rest his horse, and a warm smile. "We don't get many visitors out here," Belle said, her voice friendly, her manner open. "I can see why," Jed replied, his voice smooth, his eyes assessing. "It's a beautiful place. You're lucky to have it." Cass watched the exchange, his hand never far from his gun. He didn't like this, didn't like the way the stranger looked at Belle, the way he lingered. "We're just passing through," Cass said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "We won't be staying long." Jed's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a shame. I was hoping to get to know you better." Cass stepped forward, placing himself between Belle and the stranger. "We appreciate the hospitality, but we need to be on our way." Jed shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Suit yourselves. But if you change your mind, you know where to find me." He mounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze lingering on Belle one last time. Then he rode away, disappearing into the trees. "I don't like him, Cass," Belle said, her voice troubled, her hand reaching for his. "I don't like him either," Cass said, his voice grim. "He's trouble." Cass's instincts were rarely wrong. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't the last they had seen of Jed. He was right. A few days later, as Cass was out hunting, he stumbled upon a clue. A small, leather pouch, hidden beneath a rock. He recognized it. It was similar to the one Crandall had used to carry bribes. He opened the pouch, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found a note written in a familiar hand. A hand he had seen before, in Thomas's ledger. The note was brief, cryptic, but chilling. It was addressed to Jed. And it mentioned Cass. And Belle. The note revealed that Jed was not a prospector, but a hired killer. Sent by someone who still held a grudge, someone who wanted revenge. Someone who knew about Cass's past, about his involvement in redemption. Cass felt a surge of anger, of fear, of determination. He had to protect Belle. He had to stop Jed. He returned to the cabin, his face grim, his mind racing. He didn't tell Belle about the note, about the threat. He didn't want to frighten her. He would handle this himself. That night, as they lay in bed, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one, Cass made a decision. He would leave in the morning, before Belle awoke. He would track Jed, confront him, and end this. Once and for all. He kissed her softly, his lips lingering on hers, his heart filled with love, with regret, with determination. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he had to protect her, even if it cost him his life. He slipped out of bed, dressed quietly, and left the cabin, disappearing into the darkness. He was a hunter, once again, tracking his prey, ready to kill. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't about revenge. It was about love. It was about protecting the woman he loved. It was about securing their future. He tracked Jed, a predator silently stalking, and the night echoed with unspoken fears. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Cass tracked Jed through the rugged terrain, his senses honed, his instincts sharp. He moved like a shadow, silent and deadly, a predator stalking his prey. He knew Jed was dangerous, a skilled killer, a man with nothing to lose. But Cass was determined. He would not fail. He would not let Jed harm Belle. He found Jed camped near a small stream, his horse tethered nearby, a fire crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Jed was cleaning his gun, his movements meticulous, his face calm. He was expecting Cass.
He was ready.
Cass approached silently, his gun drawn, his finger on the trigger. He stepped into the clearing, his presence announced by the crunch of dry leaves under his boots. Jed looked up, his eyes cold and calculating, meeting Cass's. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I knew you'd come," Jed said, his voice smooth, his hand still resting on his gun. "You know why I'm here, Cass said, his voice low and steady, his gaze unwavering. Jed nodded. You're here to die. He made a move for his gun, but Cass was faster. He fired, his shot echoing through the stillness of the night. Jed cried out, clutching his chest, his body slumping to the ground. Cass approached cautiously, his gun still trained on Jed, his eyes wary. Jed was still alive, but mortally wounded.
Who sent you?
Cass demanded, his voice harsh, his anger simmering. Jed coughed, blood bubbling from his lips. He looked up at Cass, his eyes filled with hatred, with defiance. You'll never know, Jed gasped, his voice weak, his life ebbing away. He tried to raise his gun, to fire one last shot, but Cass kicked it away, his foot pressing down on Jed's chest. Tell me, Cass demanded, his voice relentless, his anger consuming him. Jed laughed, a weak, gurgling sound that was cut short by another cough. Go to hell, he whispered, his eyes closing. He was dead. Cass stood there for a moment, his gun still in his hand, his body trembling, his heart pounding. He had killed again. He had taken another life. But this time it was different. This time it was justified. This time it was necessary. He searched Jed's body, his belongings, looking for any clue, any hint of who had sent him. He found nothing. Just a few personal items, a wad of cash, and the gun. He returned to the cabin, his heart heavy, his mind troubled. He had stopped Jed, yes, but he still didn't know who was behind it all. Who wanted him dead? Who wanted Belle dead? He found Belle awake, sitting on the porch, her face pale, her eyes filled with worry. She had heard the gunshot. She knew something had happened. Cass, she said, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. What happened? He didn't answer immediately. He walked over to her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. He needed her, her warmth, her love. It's over, Belle, he said, his voice low and weary. It's finally over. He told her everything. About Jed, about the note, about the confrontation. He didn't spare any details, didn't try to soften the blow. He told her the truth. Belle listened, her body trembling, her tears flowing freely. She was afraid, yes, but she was also relieved. Cass was safe.
He had survived.
He had protected her. Who sent him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cass shook his head.
I don't know, Belle.
I couldn't find anything. The mystery remained, a lingering threat, a shadow hanging over their lives. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. They decided to leave the valley. It was no longer safe, no longer a sanctuary. The serpent had entered their paradise, and they had to move on. They packed their belongings, their hearts heavy, their minds uncertain. They didn't know where they would go, what they would do, but they knew they would face it together. As they rode away from the cabin, their home, their dream, they looked back one last time. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the valley, illuminating the beauty, the peace, that they were leaving behind. They were leaving behind a dream, yes, but they were also taking something with them. Their love, their strength, their future. The horizon beckoned. They rode to meet it together. They had survived much, and there remained a sense that the peace was not yet fully earned. Epilogue. They drifted for a time, wandering through the vast expanse of the American West, searching for a place to call home, a place to belong. They worked odd jobs, took on temporary roles, always moving, always searching. They encountered kindness and cruelty, generosity and greed, hope and despair. They saw the best and worst of humanity, the beauty and brutality of the frontier. They learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, to love each other, even more deeply. The mystery of Jed's employer remained unsolved, a lingering question mark, a shadow in their past. But it no longer consumed them, no longer defined them. They had moved on, had grown stronger, had learned to live with uncertainty. One day, they stumbled upon a small, struggling town in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a quiet, unassuming place, far from the bustling cities and the dangers of the frontier. It was called Havenwood. The town was in need of everything. A teacher, a blacksmith, a sheriff. The people were welcoming, kind, desperate for help. Cass and Belle saw an opportunity, a chance to settle down, to build a new life, to make a difference. Cass became the town sheriff, his skills as a lawman, his experience, his integrity, quickly earning him the respect and trust of the community. He brought order to Havenwood, enforced the law, and protected the innocent. Belle became the town's teacher, her gentle nature, her patience, her love of learning, inspiring the children, shaping the future of Havenwood. They built a small house on the outskirts of town, a simple, modest dwelling, but a home, filled with love, with laughter, with peace. They never forgot their past, the hardships they had endured, the losses they had suffered, the lessons they had learned. But they didn't dwell on it, didn't let it define them. They focused on the present, on their life together, on their future. Years passed. Havenwood thrived, growing from a struggling settlement into a vibrant community. Cass and Belle became pillars of the town, respected and loved by all. They never had children of their own, but they adopted many. The children of Havenwood became their children, their family, their legacy. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, Cass spoke. "Do you ever regret it, Belle?" he asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Belle knew what he was referring to. Their life, their choices, their journey. She smiled, a gentle, loving smile. "Never," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. Not for a moment. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. His hand was warm, strong, familiar. "We found our redemption, Cass," she said, her voice soft. "Not in a place, but in each other." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was filled with a lifetime of love, of gratitude, of peace. They had faced darkness, had endured hardship, had survived. And in the end, they had found everything they had ever wanted. Each other. A home. A family. A future. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land. The stars began to appear, twinkling in the vast, darkening sky. And in the quiet stillness of the evening, Cass and Belle sat together, their hands clasped, their hearts full. Their journey was over. Their life had just begun. They looked at each other as if for the first time, yet everything was known and cherished. The end.